So my name is Davis Latham. I'm a sophomore political science and economics major. I'm from Columbia. I currently serve as the chief of staff to the Speaker of the Senate, Sir Patrick Ellis. So I like to say I'm the first chief of staff ever because he's the first Speaker of the Senate ever. So that's a nice little pitch there. But I'm really passionate about the Senate. So I started in freshman council last year. Didn't really know where I was going to end up. I think some people think they're just going to jump right in. A lot of campaigns ask them. Not really that many people asked me, and so Patrick Ellis ended up being my mentor in student government, and so freshman council sets up mentors for you, and so he just kind of got to know me, asked if I would start out on helping on his campaign. So I started out with I think I was in outreach, and then I was head of internal stuff, and then I ended up being his campaign manager last year. So that was a really fun experience, but I'd never seen a campaign, and I was running a campaign, so it was really weird kind of striking that balance of how do you succeed, how do you kind of learn the ropes and everything. So then he won, obviously, and I became his chief of staff as a freshman, which was also a really weird experience because I was in there with people who had been in student government for 3 years, and I was just coming off of freshman council where you don't really see that much. You're kind of the grunt work, and I was in the meetings, pretty fresh off there. I hadn't seen that much of Senate, and so I really tried to hit the ground running, and I've learned a lot in that role. I think I've had a lot of really productive meetings. I think our time, has been marked with a lot of efficiency in the Senate, particularly a lot of transparency. And so I hope to continue that being the speaker next year. I think the speaker role in particular is really interesting because of how it deals with the Senate. And so when you jump in, it's not just you that you're working for. There are 50 senators who are all elected by the student body. You don't get to pick who they are. You don't get to pick what they care about. And you really have to make kind of their agenda work for you as well, which I think is the really important part of the job, is how do you make sure that every person in that room gets their voice, because every person in that room gets a vote. And so really striking that balance of these are my goals for the year, this is kind of the rest of the team's goals for the year, but also what are your goals for the year. And I think that's something that we've seen this year and we've been able to do really, really productively. So, we did Swipe Out Hunger, which I think was a really great program. I think it's one of the most important programs student government has done, certainly in recent history. And then, working on a medical amnesty policy while also having, all of these code changes. And the first time new initiative fund request has ever had to go to the Senate was this year. That was something I really fought for. So I don't know how much you guys have seen of that, but it's pretty much constant every week. The executives want money for this, and now they have to come kind of fight for it. And I think that's actually really good. I think that's an accountability standard that we've set up. But all in all, I would just say my main passions and my main goals are to empower the senators and to make sure that the Senate is as good of a branch as it can be.
So we'll open it up for questions now.
Okay, so you're part of the Forward campaign,
Yes.
correct?
Yeah.
So what are kind of the main goals your campaign has, or specific things you're looking
Right.
to do?
So, when talking to the group here, I can go into obviously a lot of detail. We've got a ton of different platform points, but we've really worked to nail down kind of the core four. And we think they're really unique and different than what most people are looking at. So the first is we'd like to be the first 100% Wi-Fi coverage campus in the SEC. So from the second you step on our campus to the second you leave, you shouldn't lose connection anywhere. So even walking from Preston to Green Street, you lose connection, or walking across the Horseshoe, you lose connection. We're kind of trying to mitigate that because we understand how important technology has become in the classroom and making that work everywhere. And then our second point is a program that our vice presidential candidate is really passionate about, and that's Cameron Fligger, and she's really passionate about a program called Carolina Gets Hired that she'd like to start. And so she works in the career management office in Darla Moore, and she's seen how many resources Darla Moore has to offer. Darla Moore, I don't know how many of you are in Darla Moore, probably most of you are in the School of Journalism, but it has a lot of really amazing career counselors and an amazing career center, resume workshops, and she wants to expand that to every college. I'm in arts and sciences, and that's something we lack a lot, is every major making sure they have that opportunity. And then our treasurer candidate, Adger Drummond, his main focus is what he'd like to call the Carolina Entrepreneurship Organization, or CEO, as he likes to cleverly call it. But that basically allows individual students to be able to request money as part of this organization from our Senate Finance Committee. So right now the way it works is organizations can request money, but individuals can't. So if an individual would like to go on a conference or host an event or something like that, there's no way for them to do that based on our current finance committee guidelines. You have to be in an organization. And so he'd like to create what I think is a really unique organization to be kind of that catch-all for those people and to help them individually. And then our last main of the 4-point is a program called Donations for Citations. So last year on our campaign, we ran on Swipe Out Hunger, which we were lucky enough to get done, which allows students to donate their leftover meal swipes to food insecure students. So in the first 24 hours collecting, we got over 400 meal swipes, which was actually the maximum that Airmark was willing to let us collect that cycle. So we were really, really excited about that. And we currently have students actually using that right now. I get a report each week. I think it was 21 swipes this week that were used in the Russell House from students on that program, which is really, really awesome. And what we'd like to do is take the problem of parking, which is, I don't know how much you guys have dealt with parking, but kind of the unsolvable problem. Mayor Benjamin, when he ran for student body president here, ran on fixing parking. He's now the mayor, and the parking's still pretty bad, right? And so what we'd like to do is offer what we think is a logical solution, which is that you can take your parking tickets or your parking citations, and you can donate to our Gamecock Pantry to pay that off, sort of like a tax deduction. And so that way, at least you're able to point your money in a specific way as opposed to just it going into a parking slush fund. But then on our website, like forwardcampaign.org, we have, I think, 13 subpoints, and we update those just about every day, trying to add on and everything. So we've got some more detailed points I can go into, but those are the big 4.
So with your experience in student government, for example, you're the first chief of staff, which makes you the only chief of staff, which
Yes.
makes you probably the only person on campus who really understands what the chief of staff does.
Yeah.
Do you feel like there's any sort of lack of understanding, not even just with us, but with the majority of the student body, of what student government actually does in their role for them?
Yeah, so certainly. And I think it's I'm going to take that kind of as a multi-pronged question because I think it depends each office, right? So the Senate in particular, it's really hard for students to kind of understand and know what's going on there because the main codified power of the Senate, beyond passing resolutions saying this is our stance, kind of like an editorial page, right, is to do bills, to actually change our codes. They're the only body that can change our codes. And so because that's a university policy, it's an incredibly big deal. And so most students don't really care about the mundane, why are you getting rid of subsection A of, code 240 or something like that. And so it is hard to explain that. And then I think, what students also don't realize is how much student government is actually consulted in a lot of these issues, particularly the executive offices. I think students will see a program that's implemented at the university level and they say, I really like that. And, if it doesn't have a student government seal, they think, student government had no role in this, right? And so I think the true thing about student government is we're kind of like a focus group for what the university decides to do at a larger distance, and we get to see things before they happen. And I think a lot of students would be surprised the amount of things that we kind of protest and stop from happening. I think that's actually the significant thing. Experiential learning is one of these debates, right, that we had that I actually spoke in front of the Senate about my opposition to it, which would have made a requirement to incoming freshmen, I believe it was 45 hours of service outside of the classroom that would have to be certified by the university. And so, I in particular and then our office really looked into that and we said, is this achievable for lower income students or to students with less connections? Does this seem possible? Does this seem like where the university should be moving, especially wanting particular internships? And we made the decision no, and we really fought that in a lot of ways, and then we actually got an announcement about 2 weeks later that because of protests, the administration actually decided at least for the next 2 or 3 years they weren't going to consider implementing something like that. So I think what we can talk about what we bring to the table, but I think it's also what we prevent from happening that's really significant as well.
Cool, so let's get into the next questions.
All right. Sorry. So, what do you feel like are the major responsibilities for the Speaker of the Senate, as it is a newer position
Right.
at the university, and then the Senate as a whole?
So for the Speaker, it's a really, really interesting job, kind of like I've talked about, mediating 50 different positions on issues. And so what a lot of people don't realize is that the speaker is supposed to remain really neutral in the conversations in the Senate, particularly as a presiding officer. And so I think that that's one thing that's particularly important with the role. That's important that I think Patrick has really set that standard, and that's something I would like to continue, is that we don't, say our opinion on the floor. I mean, I think the only time I ever said my opinion on the floor was experiential learning, and I made clear that was not me as part of the office, but as me as an individual. And so I think encouraging those opinions, and then I think as far as what the Senate can do, this is kind of something I take issue with, that a lot of campaigns will say. They'll say, we're going to represent the student voice. We're going to hear the students that no one else hears. We're going to go to places they don't go. And I think that's kind of vain, and I also think that doesn't take into account that there are 50 senators elected. There are senators in every single college. I cannot think of a better, more representative group than our Senate now, and what I think the Senate next year will be. And so I think the job of the Speaker and then the job of the Senate is to represent that voice. There's, people talk about how can we improve diversity on campus? How can we improve this and that? The thing about the Senate is, once you become a senator, no one can take your vote from you. Your vote matters as much as every single person in that room. You get to speak just like every single person in that room, right? That's our main focus. And so I think the job of the Senate is to represent every single faction of campus and to make that voice heard, whether it's through a resolution, a recommendation, or whether it's, tabling on Green Street and making sure students know something like experiential learning is coming.
So are your senators speaking with, how did the senators accurately represent, who they're kind of presiding over
Right.
in Senate?
So what we like them to do is we like them to always be in touch with constituents, right? And how everyone goes about that is different. Certain schools, particularly smaller colleges, have kind of an advantage in this area. So School of Music has a big advantage because there'll tend to be certain larger classes where they'll get to hear a lot of the voice, they can bring up discussion. Then Arts and Sciences, the biggest college, it's really hard to kind of gauge what every single person in there and thinking in every major. So we encourage them. We actually held a town hall this year, and so that's actually was right in the middle of experiential learning, so we kind of got lucky on that. We also try and make sure the senators are engaged on social media. We did a poll. Again, I keep bringing up experiential learning, but this was kind of the big issue that we actually saw our highest engagement in from the student body, and so we did a poll. What do you think about it? I think it was 60% of students said they wouldn't like this requirement, and so bringing that to the senators, and I'll be honest, I think there's always more we can do, right? And I think, I'm not going to sit here and say that we've been perfect this year, and that we've, that the senators are always representing the students like they should. I mean, at the end of the day, it's really hard when you're part of, a voting block that you aren't representing yourself, but representing the students. And so, we've obviously still got work to do, and I think social media is something that I really see as kind of the future of letting people know what's going on. We don't have to actually stand in front of you in the classroom. We don't have to, try and find you on the street. We can, whether you see it on Twitter or Instagram, or, we do live streams every week of our Senate sessions, which is, every executive officer gives a report there. I mean, so if you, so that's how we hope people keep up with it is through social media, and then also reaching out, and then we have their information on the website. But at the end of the day, it's really up to each individual senator as to how they go about that.
You sort of gotten into one of our questions actually, which is like how you plan to be transparent with the student body. Because let's say you succeed and everybody understands the role of the Speaker of the Senate,
right,
the Chief of Staff, what have you. How are you going to then let us know what's going on, like whether it's good, bad, whatever.
Mm-hmm. So, the Senate, because of its nature, is a pretty transparent branch. I think, you can see every piece of legislation that's proposed in our Rules Committee folder, which is on Google Drive. It's publicly available to everyone. We actually, this is something Patrick Ellis and I talked really early on, is how can we make sure that people are actually seeing the bills and the resolutions and things that are going up. So one thing we did was I started taking all of our final documents and making them text searchable. So now if you search on Google Drive, it's still a scanned PDF with Pastidi's signature on the bottom. You can still search it, which I think is, a big step forward as to seeing those individual, what gets passed and what just hits the floor. A lot of things just hit the floor or just go through Rules Committee and they don't hit the floor. And so that's kind of, I guess your question would be, can you rephrase the question again for me just one time?
For example, you said you guys maybe protest and stop some things from happening that the student body may not know about. what if I'm Joe Schmo and I would have liked that thing? Would you have told me about it beforehand?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I hope that if, there were enough Joe Schmoes, for example,
Right.
that the Senate wouldn't have protested that,
Mhm.
right? And so, and that kind of gets back to, I think, the essence of your question, too, is that if we aren't trying to take into account all of the voices or as many voices as we can, Senate may actually make the wrong decision, thinking they're representing the student body and they're not. And so, it's a constant work, it's a constant battle, and I'll be honest, I'm sure you guys see it too. A lot of students just want to go to class, and then they want to leave, and then they want to hang out with their friends, and they don't want to see, they don't want to see every bill. They don't want to see every resolution. But it's our job to make sure they can. And it's our job to make sure that they can still see all of that regardless of whether that student decides they want to or whether they don't want to. And so I think that's something we're really passionate about, and I think because the speakership, is new, this year being the first there's ever been one, you've seen that people actually care about the Senate more than I've ever, even heard. I hear people all the time, administrators will say, we've never had to worry about the Senate before, right? I mean, it used to be, you just got the student body president on board and it didn't really matter what anyone else said, right? And now we've got the Senate floor, we've brought the vice provost, we've brought, Coach Tanner came to our Senate floor, we've brought Dr. Dozier, we're bringing, the top of the top university officials are coming in there listening. The vice provost, I think, took questions for 30 minutes on experiential learning. And so they are really listening now. And so I think it's our job to make sure the student body is hearing, what these people are saying, not just the Senate is hearing what they're saying.
Right.
So, how would you, as Speaker of the Senate, hold the senators accountable if errors or mistakes occur?
Errors in what particularly?
Errors in professionalism, or if they aren't reaching out to their
Right.
constituents, or things of that nature.
Right. So we try and really harp on the senators to make sure they're doing each of their duties. And in the beginning, it was a lot more of that than that is now. So what I used to do is they have to submit committee minutes on each of their committees. And what I did for like the first 3 weeks was I was that really annoying guy who would go through and I'd printed them out and then I'd redline every single one of like, you forgot to put this here. Like, did you take this vote? You need to take this vote, and things like that. And I think a lot of it is just sitting in the room with them and helping them out, because most of the time I think errors in professionalism or incorrect maybe bill titles or misspellings or errors happen more because they don't know than, or a carelessness, right? I think the senators really do care, and I think it's about making sure they know this is the process to do it right. You can always come to us and ask anything. I mean, we are constantly having people come by and asking, hey, can you proof this bill before we put it up? I think my voice has been heard on every single bill. Can you make sure this comma's in the right place and everything? And so I think the biggest part of that is calling them out when they're wrong, right? And calling them out when they need to be called out, but also what we've really tried to do is reward them when they're right. I'm kind of a big believer in that mindset, right? So it's not about saying, you did this wrong, you did this wrong, you did this wrong. We also try and sit there and we try to say, you guys did this right. Yeah, I remember I've said this 2 or 3 times on the Senate floor, but like, this should be how all bills are written. This should be how, every student advocates for on the floor. This is how our speeches on the floor should look. We try and do that a lot, and we just try and encourage them at the end of the day, because I think if we're too hard on these people, I mean, they're still students, right? I mean, and they're elected, and I think most of them really care, if not all of them really care. And so it's about also them feeling encouraged and like their voice matters, I think brings a lot of professionalism to the table too when they know the administration is listening to them.
How important is it to you that candidates, especially for these executive positions, disclose their campaign spending? Is that something that's important to you at all?
That's an interesting issue, right? Because this is actually a debate we've had in the Senate before. Campaign spending is something where it's really easy for the general student body person to say that's a lot of money, or maybe that's less than I thought. And it's hard to quantify that, if elected, we get to represent, 35,000 people. I mean, that's more than some mayors represent. And so that's one of the things to look at is, we've got a crowd, we've got a campus, and we've got to get out to them. I think I personally am opposed to spending limits, but I am not opposed to transparency, right? And I'm not opposed to the student body knowing this is how much each person spends. And I'm not actually against the idea of a spending limit. I'm more concerned with implementation and kind of a gotcha with them. And I can go into kind of detail with that, but the basic idea would be if you can only spend, let's say, $1,000, and say I've spent $800, and then it starts raining, and you go out and buy a tent, and you say I bought it, okay, and you say that was $200, he's now disqualified because he spent over. It's really hard, we've seen how violations can kind of be gotchas, particularly, we had violations filed on us that I think were a gotcha, and so we don't want that to become the standard, particularly with finance. That's something I'm passionate about, is in an effort to make elections even, we also don't want to make it easier for people to kind of screw over others and try and frame them, for lack of a better word, and try and add up all of their spending and say, you spent 10 cents over, so now you can't run anymore type thing.
Anybody got follow-up questions?
You mentioned how you hold the Senate accountable, but if you were to make an error, how would you hold yourself accountable, and how would you make the student body aware of the errors that you've made?
I guess we've been lucky that I hope we haven't made an error to the extent that we need to go formally apologize to the student body, the Senate particularly. I think there are times when student government needs to apologize to the student body, certainly, and explain themselves. I'm a big believer in the idea of, if you're honest about kind of why you made the mistake and how it happened, I think people are forgiving, and so that's kind of my big policy. It's like I always lean on the side of, if I believe I've done something wrong, or if I'm told I did something wrong, going in there and being like, yeah, I screwed up, I hope it doesn't, hurt me too badly, but, we've made a mistake, and we've got to kind of atone for that, and we've got to work to fix it, I think, is the big thing, too.
Do you think there's a stigma that surrounds student government on campus at all?
I don't know if this is what you're asking, but I think student government is a bubble. Is that what you're asking? Or are you asking that students have a perception of student government?
Well, a little bit of both.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I can answer both. The student perspective is really hard to get, because you have some students who basically think, this is like my high school student government, right? Like, they go and they get to, plan a fun event, maybe they speak at homecoming, and like that's the extent of what they do. And then you also have some who think like, oh, these are pompous jerks, right? Like, they think they're really cool, they don't listen to us and everything. And I think the truth is, I think that can actually be accurate for some people in student government, right? But I think what our job to do is to, make sure the student body knows what we're doing. And I'm also a big idea, we talked about accountability. Let's hold our executives accountable, I am not infallible. I don't think any executive is infallible. And so I think that, the sooner we start to kind of call out when things go wrong, and also recognize when things go right, that we get a lot closer to making people understand what the average member of student government does. And then to hit a little bit on the bubble, yeah, like, there's absolutely a bubble with student government. And I think the reason there's a bubble with student government is not because, of egos and everything, but it's a lot of work, right? I mean, I'll go in and I'll start scanning legislation at 8 a.m. some days, and I won't finish, until 10, and then I run to class. And so I think because of that, and because the amount of work, we actually lose touch with the average student, because we are so often in a room with just each other, because we are actually working, that's kind of how we lose touch of the voice of the student body. And that's why I think it's so important also to have outsider perspectives, particularly the Senate is largely outsiders of student government, tends to be when they're elected, and that's why I think the Senate's so important.
So kind of touching on like the transparency and communication with students, how, I guess, do a lot of students attend student Senate meetings?
No, not particularly.
Is that something that is publicized? Like, is that something that you, as Speaker of the Senate, would want students to come to and to be involved in?
Mm-hmm. Oh, I would love students to come to Student Senate. Part of the problem is 5:30 on Wednesdays, and so that is a difficult time to get people to go, and they'll go on, 2 hours, and so getting in student engagement there is hard. Something I want to do is improve our live streaming equipment, and so this is something Patrick and I worked on this year, and not to get into too much of the nitty gritty, but because it wasn't like the university wasn't buying it, we were going to have to buy it and then get a reimbursement, and it was going to be pretty expensive equipment, and so that's why we haven't actually been able to improve our Senate equipment, is because we were going to have to pay out of pocket and then wait and hope that reimbursement would come in at some point. But earlier in the term, I'd like to really work, with the next treasurer and start that paperwork really early, like day. And so at least, even though that paperwork can take months, the second we get back from summer, we'd have brand new streaming equipment. And then that way students who, they can't go at 5:30 can watch online, live stream, and then can also watch it later on. And I also want to, right now we do it on Facebook because that's the nature of where most students will see what's going on. And I'd like to also start uploading that to YouTube. So, when you unlock, I know you guys know this, but when you get better streaming equipment, you have a lot more ability of where you can stream to. So right now we're just doing it like webcam off the laptop, so we just stream it straight to Facebook from the browser. But kind of a more long-term plan is to kind of cross-upload it, and so have it live streaming on Facebook and YouTube at the same time, and then both just save from there. And I think that makes it easier for people to find like old Senate sessions. That's one of the big problems is when it's on Facebook, it's really hard to find the old ones. And also because it's just like a webcam that's laying around on like a Chromebook, it's really bad audio and really bad video. And so, I want people to come, but if they can't come, I want them to have just as easy access to what we're talking about.
This is kind of changing the subject a little,
Yeah.
but you talked a lot about what was good about the speaker position, what y'all did well this past year. So what things, are there any that you'd like to improve for the position specifically?
I think what we dealt with the position was a lot of kind of growing pains, if that makes sense. So it was the first time anyone had been elected intentionally to voice the view of the Senate. And so, when people vote for Speaker of the Senate, they know what they're voting for versus, when they were voting for Vice President, in the past, they didn't realize they were voting for the presiding officer of the Senate. And so I think what that meant was we'd go into a lot of meetings and we'd stick up for the Senate. And, people who had been in student government for, 2-3 years, had never seen this happen before, got really mad. Because it was basically like, these are senators. They may have gotten 50 votes. Why do I care? I got 2,000, I got 3,000 votes. And so we dealt with a lot of that in the beginning. We dealt with a lot of, why are we going to listen to these 50 people who don't even have their mind straight on what they want? They all want different things. And so I think, what we started by is just being like, well, this is what they want. This is what the majority of them wants, and this is what we're going to push for. So, sorry if you disagree. But I think what we've also had to deal with is a stigma behind, Senate is also the really nerdy branch, right? And so, the speaker doesn't have the flash of, the vice presidency or the presidency where you're, the fun guy at events, you get to, MC everything. No, you're the guy who stands in a suit behind the podium and hits the gavel if someone's out of order. And so what we've tried to do is kind of explain that position a little better. And I think there's always more that can be done. I mean, I could talk for hours about what I think we could do better in every particular thing, particularly with making sure legislation gets back from pastides faster. Our turnaround times, I think, a month and a half to 2 months, from when the Senate passes it to all the chain of command it has to get up to pastides. I think that's one thing I'd like to fix. And that's something we've been able to focus on because we're an office fully focused on the Senate, and then a small set of issues beyond that. But I think we've still done a really good job. And I think if Patrick knew what we know now, and particularly what I've been able to learn this year, we would have been 10 times more productive. And I still think we were incredibly productive.
To wrap up, I guess. You mentioned Patrick was, he's the first Speaker of Senate, you're first Speaker of Staff. He served as a sort of mentor
Yeah.
for you. So if you were to be elected Speaker of the Senate, is that sort of a tradition you think you would want to carry on to the next Chief of Staff?
I'm not a big believer in this idea of a monarchy, right? Which is kind of what that would become.
Right, yeah.
I'm not a believer that the chief of staff is always the best person for the job. And I'll be honest with you guys, I know it's on video, so it's a little weird to be honest, but if you had told me, literally 4 months ago or 5 months ago, I would be running for speaker, I would have told you that you were crazy.
Right. I'm sorry. I think I messed up that question.
Yeah.
I didn't mean, do you think the Chief of Staff should be the next Speaker? I meant, is the Chief of Staff somebody who you would kind of mentor if you were the Speaker?
Absolutely, and I think the chief of staff should be someone who is also mentoring senators,
Right, okay.
so that no matter what happens, I think we should be passing on all the knowledge we learned, so that the next speaker in the next Senate always comes in with all that information.
Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt.
No, you're totally fine. Yeah.
All right, so.
I think we're ready to wrap up.
Yep, I
Okay.
think, thank you so much for coming in.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Thank you for having me.
of course.